She was mocked, humiliated, and underestimated by the very people who claimed to love her, until the moment everything turned. This marriage story isn't just about betrayal. It's about power, healing, and a woman who rose from silence to strength. You won't believe what happens when the tables finally turn. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next jaw-dropping marriage story we bring to life. It was the kind of evening that whispered elegance and expectation in every breeze that slipped between the skyscrapers of downtown Seattle. The street lamps glowed like amber beacons along the cobblestone path that led to the Lux Aria, an exclusive restaurant perched above the bay like a glass crown. I stepped out of the black car, my heels tapping against the polished stones, and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I'd been in operating rooms where seconds meant life or death, but nothing had made my pulse hum like tonight. Not because I feared a mistake. No, I was certain of my skill, of my worth. But because I wasn't just walking into a restaurant, I was walking into their world, Ryan's world, his family's world, a world that had never welcomed women who looked like me. My name is Dr. Lena Brooks, 33 years old, general practitioner, graduate of Columbia Med, daughter of a Brooklyn nurse and a city bus driver. I've saved lives in ERs, stitched wounds in disaster zones, and held dying hands in silence. But none of those moments prepared me for the performance expected tonight. I looked over at Ryan as he rounded the car to meet me, the light catching in his sandy hair. His navy suit clung to his tall frame, his smile warm, eyes sparkling like always. 36, a tech entrepreneur with a mind like quicksilver and a heart I used to believe in. You look incredible, he murmured, taking my hand in his. My mom and sister are going to love you. His optimism was earnest, sweet, and completely blind. You're sure they know I began, and then stopped myself. It was too late for that now. I wasn't going to shrink. Not tonight. They know you're amazing, he cut in. That's all they need to know. I gave a small nod and fixed a smile that I'd perfected over years of being the only black woman in rooms full of polished doubt. My emerald green dress clung like silk armor, and my hair, long, straight, dark as night, fell over my shoulders like a waterfall of defiance. My mother would have told me to stand tall. My father would have kissed my forehead and whispered, "Don't let them make you small." I walked forward. The restaurant's glass doors opened to reveal a foyer that looked like the inside of a music box. Marble floors, velvet drapes, a chandelier that hung like a crystal galaxy. Soft music from a live quartet danced with the clink of fine glassware and the low hum of Seattle's elite. This wasn't just a dinner. It was theater. And I was walking on stage with a spotlight already set. We were led to a table nestled near a wall of windows. The city sparkled below like a sea of stars. Seated at the table, framed by the glow of gold and the faint shimmer of privilege, were Margot and Sloane Colton, Ryan's mother and sister. Their poise was immaculate, their eyes sharp as polished silver. "Dr. Brooks," Margot greeted me, standing just enough to extend a hand. Her pearl necklace caught the chandelier's light like a quiet threat. Her hair was an elegant sweep of icy blonde, her tailored slate gray dress speaking in fluent old money. Her handshake was brief, her fingers barely grazing mine. How unexpected. I smiled. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Colton." "You're a doctor?" Sloane chimed in, her tone more observation than compliment. Her ivory dress hugged her slender frame, her sleek bob framing a face sharpened by ambition and youth. "Ryan said you're a general practitioner, right? Isn't that kind of basic?" The question was delivered with the same voice one might use to ask if I preferred tap or bottled water. I didn't blink. "I work with people from all walks of life," I replied calmly. "CEOs and janitors alike. Every patient deserves care." Sloane's lip twitched in what might have been amusement or contempt. "That's sweet. And you're from Brooklyn, right? That's quite a leap to hear." Her words dangled like bait, and I could feel Margot's silent appraisal at my back. I smiled again, but this one was tighter. "Yes, my parents still live there. My mother's a nurse. My father drove city buses for 30 years. Margot's brows lifted. "That's commendable. I imagine this must feel like another world." It wasn't a question, it was a quiet snub, but I had faced worse, far worse. "I've earned my place in every room I walk into," I said, my voice low and steady. Ryan sat beside me, sipping wine, smiling like he hadn't heard the tension stringing the air taut around us. He laughed at some joke from a man at the next table and turned his attention to something on his phone. I waited for his hand to squeeze mine. It didn't come. Dinner was a blur of foie gras, wine I couldn't pronounce, and conversational daggers wrapped in silk. Every compliment came with a bite, every question a trap. Margot asked if I'd ever been to Tuscany, not if I liked to travel. Sloane wondered aloud how someone from humble beginnings managed Columbia Med, implying surprise I'd been accepted at all. Ryan smiled through it all, charming and oblivious. The moment that shattered me wasn't loud. It was Margot, swirling her wine as she asked, "Lena, forgive me, but do you ever feel like Ryan's world might not quite align with yours? His network, his business, his future?" The word align stuck in my throat like smoke. I looked at her, and suddenly I wasn't in a restaurant. I was 8 again, watching my mother come home after an overnight shift, her back bent but her eyes full of fire. I was 16, watching my father repair a broken bus window in the rain. I was 25, graduating from Columbia with tears in my eyes and no one clapping louder than my parents. I looked at Ryan. He was laughing again, with someone else. Not once tonight had he seen the war I was waging in silence. I felt the heat rise behind my ribs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to walk out. But I didn't. I just folded my napkin and placed it gently on the table. "I need a moment," I said softly, rising to my feet. I caught Sloane's smirk, Margot's watchful gaze, and Ryan's late, confused glance as I walked toward the exit. My heels rang like gongs in the marble hall. I was done. I had swallowed enough. My dignity wasn't a buffet, and I wasn't serving it up for their approval. I had loved Ryan, but love wasn't enough if I had to fight alone. I pushed open the heavy doors of Lux Aria, the cold January air wrapping around me like a blade. My chest ached. My heart pounded. I was ready to leave. Ready to choose myself. I reached for my coat, and that's when the scream came from inside the restaurant. A woman's voice, sharp and terrified, "Margot." Then the sound of glass shattering, a crash, a thud. I turned around, and just like that, everything changed. The moment I turned toward the chaos, the cold air hit me harder than before, like the night itself was warning me. But I didn't move yet. Not right away. My hand hovered near the wool of my coat, heart thundering, breath caught in the tight space between decision and duty. I stood there, halfway between freedom and something I couldn't name yet. Inside, the noise grew sharper, glass shattering, chairs scraping, voices rising. A name pierced the din. "Ryan?" My fingers curled into fists, the tension that had knotted through me all night now flaring into something else, something sharper, more immediate. I stepped back inside, my heels hitting the marble again, this time not with grace, but purpose. I followed the trail of broken sound, my emerald dress brushing against the velvet drapes, past startled guests frozen in mid-bite or mid-whisper. And then I saw him. Ryan lay sprawled near the bar, his body jerking violently, his face twisted in something beyond pain. Terror. His hands clawed at the air, lips blue, his eyes rolling back. The room spun around him. Servers hovered helplessly. Margot knelt at his side, her perfect composure shattered, her voice cracked and unrecognizable. "Help him! Oh my God, someone help him!" I dropped my coat. "He's having a stroke," I called out, voice slicing through the panic. The sea of people parted. Instinct replaced emotion. Memory overrode rage. I was no longer the woman who'd been judged and picked apart. I was a doctor. I knelt beside him, the marble cold beneath my knees. His pulse was racing, irregular. His body convulsed in tight spasms, and his breath came in shallow bursts. "Ryan," I said, my tone steady, my fingers already assessing, "stay with me. You're going to be okay." "Does anyone have aspirin?" I shouted. No answer. Just panicked eyes and silence. "Low-dose aspirin. Check the kitchen, the bar, anything." I barked at a young waiter, his hands trembling. He nodded and vanished. Margot hovered beside me, useless now. Her pearl necklace dangled like a noose, her hands fluttering above her son, but not touching him, as if afraid of breaking him further. What do you need?" she stammered. I looked up. "Quiet," I said, "and space." Sloane stood a few feet away, her ivory dress askew, face pale. Her mascara ran down one cheek. For the first time tonight, there was no smirk on her lips, just fear. "Give her room," someone shouted, and the circle widened. Ryan's legs spasmed again, and I quickly adjusted his posture, gently tilting his head to keep his airway clear. I monitored his breathing, weak but present. 1 minute, 2. The waiter returned, breathless, holding a single tablet like it was a treasure. "This is all we found." I took it, guiding it carefully between Ryan's clenched teeth, urging him softly, "Chew. Chew slowly. It'll help. It'll buy us time." His eyes fluttered. His fingers clutched weakly at my arm, as if recognizing something. Maybe my voice, maybe just safety. I didn't care. I wasn't here for gratitude. I was here to save his life. The sirens came seconds later, a wailing salvation in the night. Red lights flashed against the glass walls as paramedics pushed through the doors, their boots heavy on the marble. I rose and stepped back, breath steady, face calm. Sweat clung to the back of my neck, but I kept my head high. 36-year-old male, I said crisply, briefing the medic. Suspected ischemic stroke. Seizure onset 5 to 6 minutes ago. Aspirin administered 3 minutes ago. Pulse erratic, breathing shallow. The lead paramedic, a grizzled man with tired eyes and steady hands, nodded. "Good work, Doc." He didn't ask who I was. He didn't need to. They moved swiftly, attaching monitors, checking vitals, preparing for transport. Ryan's body, limp now, was lifted onto the stretcher. His eyes barely opened, but they found mine, just for a second. Something flickered in them. Regret, fear, love. It didn't matter. Not now. The room had gone nearly silent. No clinking glasses, no soft quartet melodies, just the shuffle of gurney wheels and hushed, reverent voices. That doctor saved him. "Did you see her?" She just took control. I stepped back, retrieved my coat, and stood tall. My emerald green dress was stained now, knees dusted from the floor, creases where I had knelt. But I didn't feel ruined. I felt unshakable. Margot approached, her voice trembling. "Dr. Brooks, thank you. I didn't know you were..." Her words dangled, unsure of their landing. "I did what I was trained to do," I said simply. My tone was not warm but not cruel, just final. Sloane stepped forward, clutching her clutch like it might protect her. Her lips parted, eyes shining with something that almost looked like shame. "You saved him," she whispered. "I'm a doctor," I said, brushing past her. I didn't stay for applause. I didn't wait for apologies. I walked through the crowd, past the stairs, past the phones now lighting up with messages, photos, no doubt gossip, and out into the cold Seattle night. The air hit like truth, sharp, clean. My heels clicked softly against the stone, echoing down the steps of the restaurant that had once felt like a fortress. It felt smaller now. Or maybe I had just outgrown it. I stood at the curb, pulling my coat around me, watching as the ambulance drove off with Ryan inside. He was alive because of me. He was safe, not because of love, but because I refused to let my anger win over my purpose. But that didn't erase what had happened before the collapse. The insults, the silence, Ryan's laughter with someone else while I fought alone. And still, I had saved him. I didn't know what that said about me or about him. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. Not to that table. Not to that family. Not to that version of love that asked me to shrink. My name is Dr. Lena Brooks. I save lives. But I've stopped trying to save love that won't stand for me. And that's when I turned and walked into the dark, the city lights at my back, and the sound of sirens fading into the distance. The ambulance disappeared into the fog-touched night, its red lights spinning like a heartbeat in retreat, until the city swallowed it whole. I stood motionless, arms wrapped tight across my chest, coat half-buttoned, breath curling in white tendrils against the air. The cold didn't bother me. Not really. I'd felt colder that evening, seated at that lavish mahogany table, stripped of dignity, piece by words that cut deeper than any scalpel ever had. But I'd saved him. I'd knelt on that marble floor, surrounded by champagne flutes and chandeliers, and saved the life of the man I'd once imagined sharing a future with. A man who, just moments before, hadn't bothered to meet my gaze while his family sliced me open with smiles. My heart ached with the weight of that betrayal. But there was no room left for anger. Only clarity. I should have gone home. I should have hailed a cab, called a friend, vanished into the warm familiarity of my apartment. But something in me turned back instead, toward the restaurant, the glowing windows behind me, and then beyond, toward Seattle General. I didn't owe him anything, I told myself. But I did owe myself closure. The hospital's automatic doors parted with a whoosh, the fluorescent lights inside slicing away the softness of night. It was late, nearly 1 a.m., but hospitals never slept. They breathed. They pulsed. They endured, just like the people who passed through them. I moved with purpose through the corridors, my heels traded for flats I kept in my car, my hair twisted up, my coat pulled tight. The nurses at the front desk recognized me immediately. I didn't need to explain why I was there. My face said everything. "He's in 304. One of them said quietly, nodding down the hall. "He's stable." Room 304 stood at the end of the hallway like a question mark waiting to be answered. The door was closed, but I could hear the steady beep of monitors behind it. Familiar, mechanical, reassuring. I stood there for a long minute, palm pressed flat against the cool surface, willing myself to push it open. My breath slowed. My heart didn't. When I entered, it was quiet, dim. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting soft light over Ryan's bed. He lay propped on pillows, IV line snaking into his arm, pale hospital gown ghosting his skin. His face, once vibrant and flushed with youth, now looked hollowed out. He seemed smaller somehow, fragile in a way I'd never seen. His eyes were closed. For a brief moment I thought he was asleep, but then he stirred. Slowly, painfully, his eyes fluttered open. "Lena," he rasped, just one word. My name. A breathless thing caught between guilt and gratitude. I didn't answer right away. I stood at the foot of the bed, coat still on, arms folded, studying him like a stranger. This man had once been everything to me. Late-night talks, curled together on my couch, wild dreams built between sips of wine and long walks. We'd made plans, talked about marriage, about kids, about building something real. And yet, when I'd needed him most, when I sat in that restaurant absorbing his mother's condescension and his sister's cruelty, he hadn't stood beside me. He hadn't even noticed the battlefield I was standing on. "I heard what happened," I said finally. My voice was calm, cool, not angry, but not forgiving either. He blinked slowly, lips parted. "You saved my life." I nodded once. Yes, I did. Silence fell between us, thick with all the things he could have said earlier but never did. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I was an idiot. I didn't see it. I should have defended you. I should have said something. Anything. You laughed with a man at the next table while your family dismantled me with silverware and polite smiles," I said. Not to accuse, but to state a fact. A line in the record. He winced like my words physically hurt. I didn't realize it was that bad. "You didn't try to realize," I corrected. "That's the difference." He let out a breath, shaky and thin. "They were wrong. I was wrong. But you were amazing. The way you stepped in, the way you saved me." "I didn't save you for you," I said. My voice trembled just slightly, but I held my ground. "I saved you because that's who I am. That's what I do. Even when the people I'm saving would have left me bleeding at the table moments before." He turned his face slightly ashamed. "I love you, Lena. I know I failed you, but please, give me another chance." That word chance sat in the air like a weight. He meant it. I could see it in his face. He was sorry. But what did it mean now? What was love if it only stood with you in comfort, but not in conflict? I thought of my parents. My mother, working double shifts as a nurse, fingers swollen and back aching, never once hesitating to stand up for what she believed. My father, shoulders broad from decades of driving through chaos and traffic, teaching me how to move forward, even when the road cracked beneath me. They'd sacrificed for me, fought for me, loved me without question. And tonight, the man I thought I'd spend my life with didn't have enough courage to whisper, "That's not okay," to his own family. I stepped closer to the bed, placed a hand gently on the metal rail. "I gave you 3 years, Ryan. 3 years of my heart, my laughter, my trust." He closed his eyes, pain flooding every line of his face. "I fought for us, for me. But I fought alone. And love. Love shouldn't leave you stranded in the fire with no hand reaching back." The monitors beeped softly, each sound like a metronome counting down the end of a chapter. "I can't go back," I said. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. He nodded once, barely. Tears clung to the corners of his eyes. I could see him shrinking inside, not just from the stroke, but from the grief of something lost forever. I reached down and gently placed my hand over his. It was cold, fragile, human. "Take care of yourself," I whispered. Then I turned and walked out. The hallway was quiet. No one followed. My coat swished against my legs as I moved, my steps echoing on the linoleum. When I reached the end of the hall, I paused at the window. Outside, Seattle shimmered with 1,000 lights, each one a tiny promise. I had saved a life tonight. But more importantly, I had saved my own, and I would never forget what that cost me. The next morning, the sunlight in Seattle broke through the mist like it was trying to apologize for the night before. But no amount of light could wash away what had been said, or what hadn't. I sat alone on the bench outside the hospital, the concrete cold even through the wool of my coat. The steam from my untouched coffee curled upward into the crisp morning air. I hadn't gone home. I couldn't. After walking out of Ryan's room, I'd stayed in the on-call lounge for a few hours, watching the hospital shift between night and day, life and death, like it always did. It was comforting, in its way. Predictable chaos, unlike people, unlike love. My body was sore, my knees ached from kneeling on marble. My dress, now folded in a bag beside me, still smelled faintly of truffle oil and humiliation. I should have felt triumphant. I'd saved a man's life in a public restaurant, in front of the very people who'd called my success unexpected. I'd proven myself in front of the icy glares, the smirking dismissals, the polite disdain. I'd shown them what a black woman from Brooklyn, the daughter of a bus driver and a nurse, could do. But why did it feel like loss? Because it was. I lost something the moment I realized Ryan wouldn't stand up. That while I was cutting through barbed words with dignity, he was smiling over his wine, unaware that my heart was breaking beside him. The absence of his voice, when I needed it most, had echoed louder than Margot's snide remarks or Sloane's sugar-laced barbs. Silence, it turns out, is its own betrayal. I closed my eyes and let the morning sounds wash over me. The shuffle of nurses changing shifts, the rumble of carts, the chirp of early birds over the rustle of trees. For a moment I wished I could go back to 3 years ago, to the day I met Ryan. To that charming, idealistic boy with his worn-out sneakers and mind racing 1,000 miles an hour. He had spoken to me like I was made of stardust and certainty. I believed him then. I believed us. But love, as I'd come to understand, couldn't just be built on charm and good intentions. It needed courage, especially when the world showed its teeth. The media had picked up the story within hours. Someone had recorded the entire incident, the stroke, my intervention, my voice cutting through panic like a scalpel. The clip had gone viral overnight. Not that I cared, not really. But I couldn't ignore the headlines. Black doctor saves tech exec in high-end Seattle restaurant. Dinner party turns into medical emergency. Doctor girlfriend steps in. Hero in emerald green, a woman saves the man who let her down. That last one made me pause. They didn't know the half of it. Back at the restaurant, apparently, everything had changed the moment I left. The guests had fallen into stunned silence. The quartet never resumed playing. Margot and Sloane reportedly sat frozen in their seats, the caviar congealing on plates no one touched. Their disapproval had withered in the face of reality, of mortality, of competence they could neither question nor ignore. I wasn't there to see it, but I imagined it. The quiet reevaluation, the crack in their icy certainty. The knowledge that the woman they tried to measure against fine china and family lineage had just saved their son's life with nothing but her hands and her training. No pearls, no pedigree. Just pure purpose. And yet, I didn't feel victorious, because I didn't want their respect in the aftermath of collapse. I didn't want their apologies dragged from the wreckage of their fear. I wanted Ryan to have seen me from the start. I wanted him to have stood up, not when it was too late, not after the ambulance, but at that dinner table, when it actually mattered. He hadn't. And that truth sat heavy on my chest like a stone that refused to be lifted. Later that afternoon, I returned to the restaurant to pick up something I'd left behind. A pair of gloves tucked in the sleeve of my coat, maybe. I wasn't sure. I think I needed to see it again, to prove to myself that it was real, that everything I'd felt hadn't been some dramatized exaggeration born of exhaustion and heartbreak. Lux Aria was nearly empty, the chandeliers dimmed in the afternoon light. A manager greeted me with quiet reverence, his tone respectful now, like I was someone important. A few servers gave me cautious nods. There were whispers, half smiles. One said softly, "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. We didn't know. We're glad you were here." I gave a tight smile, not because I was ungrateful, but because I was tired. Tired of proving myself. Tired of saving lives only to be measured afterward by the color of my skin or the texture of my hair. At the hostess stand, I found my gloves folded neatly beside a fresh linen napkin and a handwritten note. Dr. Brooks, words will never be enough. I was wrong. We were wrong. Thank you, Margot. I stared at it for a long time. Her handwriting was elegant, looping, practiced, the kind that came from prep schools and engraved fountain pens. I ran my thumb over the ink, waiting for it to mean something, but it didn't. Not really. Apologies are easy after your world has nearly unraveled. What I needed wasn't her guilt. It was her respect, but earned before the stroke, not after. As I walked out, I passed the very window I had once gazed through the night before, the skyline rising in the distance like a promise still waiting to be fulfilled. It shimmered in the sunlight, unwavering, brilliant. I stared at it for a moment, my reflection faint in the glass, layered over the city like a shadow. I had changed. I could feel it. Something inside me had cracked open, not in a way that broke me, but in a way that let more light in. I had chosen myself. Walked away when it would have been easier to stay. I had drawn a line in the marble of that restaurant and said, this far, no further. It didn't feel like a grand victory. It didn't come with fanfare, but it felt clean, solid. And sometimes survival isn't about roaring. It's about standing up, quietly and surely, and walking away. I returned home that night, finally, and dropped my coat onto the chair near the door. The apartment was still, familiar. My plants had leaned toward the window, chasing the winter light. A single red mug sat by the sink from the morning I'd left for that dinner. I stood in the middle of the room, no makeup, no pretense, and breathed. I had saved a life. But more than that, I had saved my own voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. The hospital room had fallen into a hush after I left, but my heart hadn't. It beat a quiet rhythm of regret as I stood at the elevator, staring at the mirrored doors, watching my own reflection waver like a candle in the wind. I had done the right thing. I knew it. I'd walked away not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And yet, it still hurt. 3 years. That's how long Ryan and I had been together. 3 years of shared books, whispered dreams under blankets, takeout sushi in front of reruns. And plans. So many plans. We'd talked about opening a clinic together someday, fusing medicine and technology. He wanted to streamline patient care with an app. I wanted to treat the people who'd never be able to afford one. We thought we were building a future. Turns out, we'd been writing 2 different blueprints all along. I remember the first time I saw him across a hospital fundraiser. He was standing by the dessert table, awkwardly balancing a plate of chocolate mousse and trying to make polite small talk with an orthopedic surgeon who clearly wasn't interested. I was on a break from a panel discussion, still in my white coat, laughing with a colleague when he noticed me. We locked eyes and he did that boyish half-smile like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be impressed. He walked over, introduced himself. We talked for 15 minutes. He asked me out. I said no. He asked again a week later. I said maybe. By the 3rd time, he brought coffee and waited outside my clinic. Persistence. That's what I used to call it. Back then, it felt romantic. Now, standing in that corridor, all I could feel was the weight of everything he hadn't said when it mattered most. I didn't cry. I wanted to. I wanted to let the tears spill onto the hospital floor, to let the pain bleed out of me. But instead, I took a deep breath and pressed the elevator button. The ride down felt eternal. In the days that followed, I didn't hear from Ryan. Not directly, at least. There were messages from the hospital about his condition, stable, recovering, responsive. I got updates through colleagues, whispers in the hallway, nods of acknowledgement. His family didn't reach out either. Not that I expected them to. Maybe Margot was still choking on her pride. Maybe Sloane didn't know how to bridge a gap that had become a chasm. Either way, the silence from them was almost a relief. It meant I didn't have to reopen wounds that had barely begun to scab. But then, 4 days later, my phone rang while I was reviewing labs in my office. Hey, Lena. It's Ryan. His voice was raspy, a little slurred. I could picture him lying there in that sterile room, wires taped to his chest, his blue eyes full of something softer than they'd ever been when we were together. I just wanted to say thank you again, he continued. And also, I understand if you don't want to talk. I need to say this. I didn't interrupt. I failed you, he said. Not during the stroke. Before that, I failed you at that table. I sat there and watched them slice you apart like you were an exhibit, not the woman I love. And I didn't say a word. There it was, the truth finally spoken aloud. I don't want sympathy, Lena. I just want to tell you I see it now. All of it. And I'm sorry. I'll spend every day trying to be the kind of man who would have stood up in that moment. But I also know I might have already lost you. He paused. I just wanted you to hear it from me. Then he hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to feel, but because I finally did. Closure isn't always a clean break. Sometimes it's a slow, tender unraveling. And that message? That was the last thread. The next week, I returned to the clinic, my real sanctuary. Tucked into a modest corner of Rainier Valley, the building wasn't much, brick, a faded sign, paint peeling in places. But it was mine. And more importantly, it was theirs. The patients, the single mothers, the undocumented workers, the teenagers seeking refuge from broken homes, the elderly immigrants who couldn't read their prescriptions but trusted my hands. I walked into the waiting room that Monday morning, and Aisha, one of my youngest patients, ran up and hugged me around the waist. Mom said you saved a man at a fancy restaurant, she beamed. I laughed, gently ruffling her braids. Something like that. Word had spread. Not from me, I never spoke of it, but from the internet. The video had made its rounds. The community had seen it, recognized me, lifted me higher than any gala ever could. Later that afternoon, I stood at the exam table with Mrs. Ocampo, a retired teacher from El Salvador, with a heart murmur and a wicked sense of humor. You look tired, Doctora, she said, peering over her bifocals, but stronger. I smiled. It's been a long week. You've had many long weeks, she said, patting my hand, but you keep showing up. That's what matters. That night, after locking up the clinic, I sat at my desk and looked around at the framed drawings from kids, the post-it notes from grateful patients, the potted plant someone gave me last Christmas. This was my legacy, not the glittering tables of Lux Aria, not the hollow apologies, not even the headlines. It was the way Mr. Tran, a former refugee, smiled every time he walked into my office. The way Rosa, a mother of 5, brought homemade empanadas when she couldn't afford her copay. The way Aisha's asthma had gone from daily ER visits to completely manageable, because I'd taken the time to educate her mother in her own language. This was what mattered. Later that week, I received an email from a journalist asking for an interview. They wanted to talk about the restaurant incident. America's new medical hero, they called me. I didn't respond, because I hadn't saved a life to be a headline. I had done it because it was my job, because it was in my bones, because my mother, even after night shifts so long she could barely stand, used to whisper to me, "You help people, baby girl, that's your power." And now I was finally living it. Ryan's apology lingered in my voicemail for a few more days before I finally deleted it, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need it anymore. I had saved him. I had saved myself. And now I was moving forward, not with bitterness, but with purpose. Not with a broken heart, but with one that was whole again. Not waiting for someone else to see me, but shining because I saw myself. The spring rains came late that year, washing the streets of Seattle in silver, softening the sky with a quiet kind of melancholy. But inside my clinic, inside Marshall Health, everything pulsed with motion and warmth. It smelled like eucalyptus oil, printer ink, and occasionally arroz con pollo when Mrs. Delgado brought lunch for the staff. The floor tiles were scuffed in places, and one of the waiting room chairs had a permanent squeak. But it was mine. No, ours. A place where lives weren't just treated, they were seen. Every morning, I unlocked the glass door beneath the weathered sign and stepped into a space that felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived with Ryan. The walls were covered in hand-drawn cards from children and faded Polaroids of healed wounds, reunited families, and first ultrasounds. There were no chandeliers here, no velvet drapes, no violins humming behind crystal glasses. Just the rhythmic cough of the copy machine, the hum of a space heater in the back office, and the sacred chorus of real people walking through the door. I treated a man named Sam that week, 59, homeless, diabetic, limping from a deep ulcer on his foot. I cleaned the wound myself, my gloved hand steady, and when I asked why he hadn't come in sooner, he shrugged and said, "Didn't think a place like this would want someone like me." That someone like me sat with me long after I finished the chart. I'd heard it 100 different ways from 100 different mouths. People who had been made to feel small, unwanted, invisible, just like I had felt at that dinner table. But here, no one disappeared. No one was overlooked. By the end of the week, Sam's infection was under control, and he smiled when he left, a bag of clean socks in one hand, a follow-up appointment card in the other. He told me I had a gift. I told him I just had good training. Truth was, I had both, and something more. I had fire. After what happened at Luxaria, the world wanted to make me a symbol. News stations emailed, hospital boards reached out, even a pharmaceutical brand asked if I'd consider endorsing their new heart medication. I declined every offer, because my work didn't need to be spotlighted, it needed to be done. And it was being done, every single day. I had a team of 4 now, 2 nurses, a rotating resident, and a front desk assistant named Jasmine who kept the whole place from catching fire. We treated everything from strep throat to broken fingers to grief that sat too long in someone's chest. We stitched lacerations and repaired trust in the system, one conversation at a time. Late one Thursday, I found myself sitting alone in my office. Outside, the rain tapped on the window like it was asking to be let in. My coat hung on the back of the door, my stethoscope coiled beside a stack of charts, and my computer screen glowed with a half-written research proposal. I was working on a new protocol for early detection of sepsis, particularly in underserved populations where diagnosis often came too late. It was data-heavy, tedious at times, but it mattered. Just like the patients. That night, I got a knock on the door. It was Thomas Bennett. I hadn't expected to see him, certainly not standing in my clinic with his tie loosened and his coat soaked from the rain. He held a manila envelope under one arm and a curious smile on his face. "I hope this isn't a bad time," he said. "It's late," I replied, but I stepped aside anyway. He shook off the rain like a retriever and looked around, eyes scanning the modest space with the quiet reverence of someone who knew exactly what it meant to build something from the ground up. "This place," he said, voice low, "is alive." "I hope so," I replied. "Otherwise, I've been prescribing antibiotics to a haunted building." He smiled. Thomas had always been direct. A decade older than me, with salt in his dark hair and a presence that made people stand a little straighter when he walked in. We'd first met at a medical conference a few months after the incident. I'd presented my early findings on delayed sepsis response in minority communities. He was the keynote speaker. Brilliant, poised, and unlike most hospital directors, he actually listened when others spoke. Tonight, he placed the envelope on my desk. "This is a grant proposal," he said. "From the foundation. They're impressed with your outcomes. They want to fund mobile health outreach." I blinked. "Like a traveling unit?" He nodded. "Staffed, stocked, operated under your clinic's banner." I sat down slowly, fingers brushing the folder's edge. It felt surreal, like opening a door you didn't know existed. "You'd be the lead, of course," he added. "Why me?" I asked. "There are other doctors, bigger institutions." "Because you don't just treat people, Lena," he said. "You reach them." That stopped me cold. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked around my office, the hand sanitizer bottle, the old mug with pens jammed inside, the framed photo of my parents on the shelf behind me, my mother in scrubs, my father in his MTA uniform, smiling like they always did, exhausted but proud. They had raised me to be the kind of woman who made things better. Not louder, not shinier, just better. That night, I said yes to the grant. Not for the prestige. Not even for the expansion, but because somewhere out there was another Sam, another Isha, another Rosa, and I refused to let them go unseen. After Thomas left, I stood in the doorway of the clinic for a long while, watching the rain streak across the glass. The city glowed in the distance, soft gold and blue like a heartbeat. I pulled my coat around my shoulders and breathed deep. There would always be people like Margot Colton in this world. Those who saw a woman like me and measured my worth against linen napkins and bloodlines. But they didn't get to write my story. I did. And my story wasn't a dinner party. It was a movement. It was a mother with 3 jobs finally able to see a doctor. It was a boy whose asthma didn't take him to the ER anymore. It was a clinic filled with laughter and tears and real lives being held together by calloused hands and soft words. That was what mattered. And the next chapter? It was already being written, one patient at a time. The conference room was quiet, almost reverent, the kind of silence that hangs in the air before something important begins. It was early summer in Seattle, warm light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows at Seattle General, and I stood at the head of a long oak table, my laptop open, my research slides glowing on the screen behind me. A glass of water sat untouched beside my notes, and a small, confident smile curved on my lips as I looked out over the room. This was my world now. Not the sterile cold of judgmental dinner tables or the dim corners of luxury that came with unspoken terms. No, this was a space of ideas, of knowledge, of earned respect. And today, I wasn't just participating, I was leading. "Let's begin," I said, clicking the remote in my hand. I was presenting the updated results of the sepsis protocol we'd piloted at Marshall Health, a set of early detection techniques and community-oriented screenings that had reduced hospitalization rates by nearly 30% among our underserved patients. The data was clear, the lives impacted measurable. But what moved people most wasn't the charts or graphs, it was the stories. I told them about Mrs. Lewis, a grandmother who came in for a rash and left with an early-stage infection diagnosis that saved her life. I shared how we'd trained local volunteers to flag warning signs, turning grocery store cashiers and Sunday school teachers into frontline advocates. I talked about giving power back to the people often left furthest from it. Around the table, heads nodded. Questions came. Challenges. Admiration. And Thomas Bennett sat across from me, listening, really listening. His hazel eyes were focused, not just on the data, but on me. He asked questions that dug deeper, not to trip me up, but to understand. He wasn't performative like other directors I'd met. He didn't flatter or interrupt. He simply absorbed, reflected, responded. It was rare and real. By the time the meeting ended, the room was buzzing. Doctors and department leads approached me with ideas for collaborations, invitations to speak, requests for training templates. One even asked if I'd consider writing a paper together. I said yes to everything that mattered, and no to anything that smelled like performative charity. Afterward, as the room cleared, Thomas lingered behind. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, his jacket slightly wrinkled from leaning into the table. I packed up slowly, waiting for the moment I could feel coming. "You do more than save lives," he said, eyes still on the skyline. "You change how people see themselves." I paused. That wasn't a compliment, it was a revelation. He turned to face me. "You ever have one of those moments where you realize you've been working in medicine for 20 years, and then someone comes along and reminds you why you started?" My smile was soft but knowing. "I've had a few." He chuckled. "I'm having one now." That afternoon turned into several more. We began working together closely, at first just on the mobile clinic unit funded by the grant, then on broader training programs, tech integrations, staff development. What surprised me most wasn't just how well we worked together, but how easy it felt. Effortless, without being casual. Focused, without being rigid. One evening, we met at a small cafe near the water to discuss staffing timelines. The place was quiet, with warm orange lighting and the faint scent of espresso clinging to the air. I was scribbling notes on a napkin when he looked up and said, "You always lead with your heart, even when the numbers matter." I glanced at him. "That's the only way I know how to lead." He nodded, thoughtful. "It shows." We sat in that soft silence for a few moments, the kind that settles comfortably between people who've stopped pretending. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Can I ask you something not entirely professional?" I looked at him, cautious but open. "Sure. Do you ever think about something more?" It wasn't a proposition, not even a suggestion, just a question, an honest one. I swallowed slowly. My heart didn't race, it just softened. "I used to," I admitted, "but the last time I thought I had it, I realized I was the only one holding it up." His gaze was steady but gentle. "I'm not looking to be rescued," he said, "and I don't need to be your center. But I do see you, Lena. Not because of your resume or your brilliance, but because of who you are when no one's watching." I blinked, taken off guard by the clarity in his words. There was no performance here, just quiet truth. "I'm not ready," I said, voice low. "You don't have to be," he replied without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't romantic in the way movies teach you to expect, with orchestras and perfect timing. It was more like a promise whispered under breath, a thread slowly tying two lives together. And so we worked, day after day, side by side. At the hospital gala a few weeks later, I wore a sapphire dress, the fabric draped in ways that made me feel elegant but unarmored. My hair fell over one shoulder in soft waves, and as I stood at the edge of the ballroom watching donors swirl past in tuxedos and gowns, I felt still. Then Thomas approached, his tux impeccable, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. "You look like the moment everyone else is dressing up to become," he said, quiet enough for only me to hear. I laughed. "That's not a line I expected from a hospital director." He grinned. "It's not a line, it's just the truth." We danced once that night, nothing elaborate, just two people moving gently to a melody neither of us needed to name. His hands were respectful, his presence grounding. I didn't feel owned or claimed. I felt seen. Not for what I could give, but for who I was when all the giving stopped. As we stepped out onto the balcony later, the city glittered beneath us, the air cool against my skin. He looked out across the skyline, then turned to me. "I know you're still healing," he said, "and I would never ask you to rush. But just know, when you're ready, I'm here, fully. No conditions." I nodded, tears stinging unexpectedly at the edges of my vision. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I realized something. Healing doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in small, steady echoes, in someone who waits without pressure, in a hand that doesn't pull, but simply rests nearby, open. And for the first time since Luxaria, I felt a flicker of hope. Not for rescue, but for possibility. The October wind curled around the Seattle waterfront like a silk scarf in motion, brisk but not bitter, alive with change. The maple trees along the boardwalk burned crimson and gold, their leaves falling like confetti onto the pavement. I stood just past the edge of the community festival, near the pier, the hum of laughter and music lingering behind me, and let the air carry it all through me. The weight, the quiet joy, the soft, steady beat of something finally whole. I was 33 now, and somehow, for the first time in years, I felt like all the pieces of myself had found their rightful places. The mobile clinic had launched that summer, a pale blue van with Marshall Health stenciled in clean white lettering on the side and heart monitors humming in the back. We'd taken it into the rural stretches of Washington, down winding gravel roads, past horse pastures and tired barns, into towns where healthcare was a myth wrapped in red tape. People lined up at churches and town halls, holding paper tickets and coffee thermoses, waiting for someone, anyone, to see them. And I did. We did. I'd stitched wounds, administered vaccines, diagnosed hypertension in stooped men who hadn't seen a doctor in 20 years. We caught 2 strokes early, one case of undetected sepsis, one ovarian tumor in a woman who thought her stomach cramps were just age. They cried, they thanked us, they offered casseroles. Sometimes they just sat silent and stunned in the folding chair beside me because being seen, truly seen, was unfamiliar. It was exhausting and sacred, and it felt like everything I was meant to do. Tonight's event had been thrown in our honor, part community fundraiser, part harvest celebration. Children ran through the crowds with painted faces, families sipped cider from paper cups, and an old soul band played Marvin Gaye covers under a string of fairy lights. The air smelled like cinnamon and smoked apples, and I had smiled more in the last hour than I had in weeks. And then, out of the crowd, came someone I hadn't expected to see. "Lena," a voice called. Soft but unmistakable. I turned. It was Sloane. She looked different, less sharp, less polished, like the edges of her had been sanded down by time or by something deeper. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her makeup minimal, her eyes clearer. She wore a simple sweater, jeans, and clutched a manila folder in her hands like it held something fragile. "I was hoping you'd be here," she said, offering a tentative smile. "I didn't want to just send this." I said nothing, not yet, just watched her, cautious, curious. She held out the folder. "I've been volunteering at your clinic, the mobile unit." Quietly. I didn't want to make it about me, but I've been helping with outreach, data entry, Spanish translations. I've been learning. I raised an eyebrow, still waiting. She opened the folder and held it out between us. "This is a proposal for an expansion, a second mobile unit, for the tribal reservations in eastern Washington, with grant targets and budget estimates. I worked on it with Jasmine." she said. She thought you should see it. I took the folder slowly. Inside, the proposal was thorough, respectful, thoughtful, real. My throat tightened. Why? Sloane looked down, then back up. Because that night at Luxaria, I was cruel. I was ignorant, and I've spent a long time trying to outrun who I was. But working with your patients, I see now, not just what you do, but why you do it. I wanted to help, not to erase what I did, but to earn something better. Actions matter, I said, my voice calm but strong. And you're showing them. Let's talk next week. Relief bloomed across her face like dawn. She stepped back, nodded, and disappeared into the crowd. And just like that, something long frozen inside me cracked, just enough to let a little more light in. I turned back toward the water. The sun had dropped lower, dipping behind the horizon like a secret. And standing a few feet away, watching me with that same quiet steadiness, was Thomas. He smiled as he walked toward me, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders relaxed. His hazel eyes glinted with the warmth of someone who had waited, not out of obligation, but because he believed in what came next. "You okay?" he asked, voice gentle. I nodded. "Yeah, just surprised." "Sloane?" "Yeah, she's trying." "And you?" I smiled softly. "I'm open." He reached out, not to pull me, not to possess, but to offer. His hand found mine, and I let it. There was nothing flashy between us. No declarations, no burning urgency, just the calm certainty of something built slowly, honestly. "You're a force," he said. "You don't just heal people, Lena. You change them." I thought of my parents then. My mother's weary night shifts, her laughter over burned eggs and old soap operas. My father's calloused hands fixing my bike, his pride tucked in the corners of every hug. They had poured everything into me, expecting nothing but the hope I'd have it easier. And here I was, standing on a pier with a man who didn't need to be my everything, because he saw I already was. "I don't need saving," I said. "I know," Thomas replied, "but I'm here anyway." We walked back into the festival hand in hand, the music rising behind us. People smiled as we passed, some nodding in recognition. But I didn't need their approval. I didn't need anyone's, because I was no longer proving. I was living. That night, as the stars began to pierce through the Seattle sky, we stopped near the mobile clinic. The soft blue paint caught the glow of the festival lights, and on the side, beneath the logo, someone had taped a hand-drawn sign from a child. "Dr. Lena saved my mom. She's my hero." I didn't cry, but my heart swelled so large I thought it might lift me off the ground. Later, before we left, I pulled Thomas aside. "I'm ready," I said, the words quiet but steady. He didn't ask, "For what?" He just smiled, like he'd known this was coming, like he trusted me to find it on my own. "For us," he said. "For what I choose," I answered, "and I choose this." The city pulsed around us. The water shimmered, the music carried into the night, and as we stood there, our fingers laced, my soul finally settled. I was not a woman rising from ashes. I was a woman who had built her own fire and kept it burning. For love, for justice, for legacy, and for myself. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If you're still here, it means you felt something, and I'm deeply grateful for that. Lena's story reminds us of a powerful truth. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to walk away from what doesn't serve you. Sometimes it's choosing yourself when no one else does. And sometimes it's standing firm in who you are, even when the world tries to make you feel small. We all deserve a love that shows up, that speaks up, and that stands beside us when it counts. But more than anything, we deserve to be whole on our own terms. Now, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Whether you're in Seattle, New York, Lagos, or London, your voice matters here. And if this story moved you, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next powerful story. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more stories that inspire, heal, and ignite something deep within. Until next time, keep shining, keep standing tall, and never forget your worth.